Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I'm Evelyn Marcus.
And I'm Phyllis Zimbler-Miller.
A few months ago, South Africa started a lawsuit in the International Court of Justice against Israel with the allegation of genocide in Gaza. We discussed this with two Jewish leaders in South Africa, and we'll speak about the anti-Semitism the Jewish community currently experiences there. Karen Milner is the chairperson of the South African Jewish Board and a member of the Executive Committee of the World Jewish Congress. In addition, she's a professor of psychology at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, or WITS. Mary Kluk is the vice president of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies and the president of the Africa-Australia Jewish Congress of the World Jewish Congress. In addition, she's the director of the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center. Karen and Mary, thank you so much for coming on our show. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Evelyn.
So the first question today, not a quiz show, but Mary, before we discuss the lawsuit, let's talk a little bit about what's the anti-Semitism on the ground in South Africa since October 7th, and do Jews feel more threatened these days there, or being known as Jewish?
I'm so glad that you've started with that question, Phyllis, because it's often assumed by so many people outside of the country that because of the difficult situation with our government, and obviously we'll have time on this show to talk about that at some length, that the country is anti-Semitic. And on the ground, we're experiencing a lot of anti-Semitism. We have this really strange inversion happening in our country, where the government, and as I say, you'll hear a lot about that, is really been a cause for deep anxiety within the community. There's an enormous sense of betrayal, et cetera, amongst the Jewish community. But on the ground, as your question asks, we experience more anti-Semitism than we did previous to 7th of October, but nothing like what we might have imagined, given the permission, so to speak, the government might have given people by the stance that they've taken. And that I wear a necklace, free the hostage necklace, all the time. We have anecdotally Jewish jewelers who tell us that the sale of Jewish signalia and Magen Davids, etc., they can't keep up with the demand, that people are so comfortable to feel Jewish, and there are no experiences where people are talking about not wearing a kippah to walk to shul, etc. They wouldn't carry an Israeli flag. And that's the dilemma, and that's the dichotomy that we live with. And as Karen and I often speak about, in South Africa, we are jostling to find peace with paradox. That we live in a country where the people, when you walk past and are obviously observant in a religious form and wear a yarmulke, they might come up to you and say shalom, but not so much if you are known to be supporting the government of Israel. So I think I'd like Karen to maybe add to that, because it's a really important question, Phyllis, and something that is hard to almost describe. I spend quite a lot of time with our children in London, and it's a completely different atmosphere, despite the incredibly supportive government that is the government of the UK.
And Karen, as you answer, could you also give us what about college campuses in South Africa, especially since you're a professor of psychology at a university?
Sure. So I'll carry on directly where Mary left off, because I agree with her completely. And I think what's really fascinating, and I think it is really a testament to South Africans, and to the fact that South Africans really are such it's a very inclusive society. Perhaps it's because of our history, perhaps because of the history of apartheid and the importance of nation building post-apartheid. I think there are various attributions you can make to why on the ground there actually is very, very little hate that we experience. And when I hear some of the stories that have come out from the US, from the UK, of people being approached in the street, people being sworn at, people being hate being directed at them on a constant basis, it's not something that we experience, certainly not something that we experience regularly. There are incidences, so I don't want to suggest that it's non-existent. But in the context of, I think when people look at us, and as Mary said before, in the context of the position that our government has taken, there is this strange paradox that we all have continued our lives as very, very proud Jews in South Africa. Just about nothing has changed in terms of the way we live our lives as proud Jews in South Africa. Yet we are incredibly anxious about and disturbed by the position that the government has taken, which I'm assuming we'll talk about a bit later.
Yes.
On college campuses, I don't know if you want me to carry on and talk about the college campuses.
Just for a couple minutes.
Okay, so there are a number of campuses, and the two main ones or three main ones that Jewish students go to. There's two in Johannesburg, which are called WITS, which is my campus, University of Johannesburg. And then there's a major campus in Cape Town, which is the University of Cape Town. And there's one in Pretoria, University of Pretoria. Those are probably the four campuses. And over the years, there have been lots of issues, particularly around, and I think it has come to the US. It used to be quite a South African phenomenon, what we call Israel Apartheid Week, which many of our students have converted to Israel Awareness Week. But I think that we are not seeing the kind of ongoing protest and the ongoing disturbances and what seems from afar to be real aggression against Jewish students in many American campuses. We're not seeing that in South Africa. We did see some unfortunate incidences over the Israel Apartheid Week at the University of Cape Town. But even that actually required people who were not students to come onto campus. The students themselves were not particularly active on it. The problematic people who were problematic were not students. On Wits University, I kind of went past the student stand. There's always a Jewish student stand that they talk about the conflict, they talk about their history, and it was beautiful. It was students coming, it was students getting posters, and they had posters of the hostages up. And in fact, we had 2 Nova survivors who spoke on the campuses, and were really, really powerful speakers on the campuses. So it's not like it's not existent. We've worked really, really hard also with other student organizations to get them to understand what is a tiny minority of a tiny minority in South Africa, and why this is such a sensitive issue for this. And I think that while there are still problems, we've had quite a lot of success in making sure that this has not turned students' university experiences in South Africa into an unwelcoming or unpleasant experience.
So that's great to hear. So from what I understand is that Jews do experience more anti-Semitic incidents in South Africa than before October 7, but it's still, you still feel free as Jews to express yourselves with Jewish symbols without fear. The population is not very hateful towards Jews right now. When you carry a Israeli flag, it's different. But your biggest problem is with your government. So let's talk about that. Mary, what are the ties between the government of South Africa and Hamas? And how does this affect Israel and the Jewish community in South Africa?
So, Evelyn, that's the nub of it. In South Africa, in September, and I think what would be, I don't know if it would be too much, but possibly Karen and I can just share a chronology of what transpired in South Africa for us and for the Jewish world as it's come to be from out of South Africa post October 7th. On October 7th, Karen and I were in direct contact with each other endlessly. It was obviously Shabbat, and for many of our leadership, it was not possible to be in touch. It was a traumatic day as for everybody, and we waited, as all Jewish leadership organizations waited for the statement from our government. We were aware that there had been hostility. We were very much, as the Jewish leadership, in touch with our government. We always had a very open relationship. There was a clear understanding of their frustration with Israeli government policy. We had no idea that it could manifest as it has. We had a sense that there would be a parav. We thought there would be, limited. We definitely didn't understand that there would be zero sympathy for Jewish victims. There would be zero calling out of Hamas in the initial statement. And for us, by Sunday night, the trauma started to set in for us. The real sense of how there was little comment, little mention. It was kind of in veiled terms, you had it coming. This word context again. So I think for us, that was where the community is completely traumatized. To live in an environment where the leadership, and subsequent to that, a week later, again, the following Shabbat, our government, the cabinet, the sort of top echelons of South African government had their national executive meeting, and on the lawns of our White House, the Union buildings, on that Saturday, the president and his cabinet came out, called a media press release, all came out wearing their keffiyeh and speaking about the terrible activities that Israel is now embarking on, and again, expressed no sympathy, etc., etc. So I think for us, the trauma began with that first week, and it required an enormous amount of courageous leadership on our part, because although we had known that the government had allegiance, and we could talk for hours on the reasons why there is an allegiance with the Palestinian people and the South African African National Congress, which is the ruling party in South Africa, etc., etc. What's been really difficult is the complete and utter disregard for what we considered to be Jewish life. And Karen wrote a letter that we took out a full-page advertisement in the main newspaper, Sunday newspaper in South Africa, sponsored for us, where Karen wrote a letter, "Dear Mr. President." And so it was the beginning of our leadership coming out and confronting our government in a way that we had never imagined we would have to. And it was it's been a painful process, because since then the government have doubled down, and I want Karen to continue with that. And I know that I've digressed from your question, but pretty shortly after that, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Minister Naledi Pandor, herself a convert to Islam, went to visit in September. No, it was the November meetings of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and she en route stopped off in Tehran and had photographs with the president of Iran that were posted by the Iranians, actually, not by the South African government, on social media. So we were made aware of it. And not long after that, Hamas came to South Africa. The Hamas leadership were hosted not only by the African National Congress, ostensibly not by the government, by the ruling party, the ANC, but also by the top echelons of the Anglican Church in South Africa, on the steps of the St. George's Cathedral, an iconic space in the fight against apartheid in South Africa, was occupied by the leadership of the Anglican Church and Hamas leadership. So it's against that backdrop that you can understand why I was so pleased that you asked the question first, because we are as astounded as it sounds to you at the outpouring of neutrality, if not support, from the ground in South Africa. Karen, can you pick up from there on where we are in terms of, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
I think it's helpful.
And could you just give us one sentence of what your letter said, basically, and what the reaction to the letter? Let's go back a little bit. Just I'm curious what your letter said.
So the letter really, and I hope that we were really respectful, because we've had actually a really excellent relationship since the end of apartheid between the South African Jewish community and the ruling party. And we've kind of always agreed to, I think the best way to put it is we understand, as Mary said, we understand some of the sympathies that the ANC have had with the Palestinian cause. But at the same time, the ANC government has always understood the importance of nation building, the relationship with between the Jewish community and Israel, and has really successfully balanced its understanding of its citizens and its need to protect its own citizens with its sympathy and its coming from its past. So this fundamental break with that position we saw as a complete betrayal of the community. And that's really what we put into the letter. We simply said that the way in which the government and the ANC had reacted to October the 7th, and you need to realize this was a week afterwards. We're not talking about months into a war. We're talking about in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th. The fact that they had not concerned themselves with the South Africans, one of whom was killed in the 7th of October attack, at least one of whom was a hostage, and we knew was a hostage at that stage. Unfortunately, he's subsequently been, he didn't survive. That they didn't show any concern for their own citizens who were affected by the attack or who were attacked themselves. So that's the first instance that we felt betrayed. A second instance that we felt betrayed was as a community that had always expected that there would be some kind of outrage when an attack of this nature was committed, that there would be some kind of recognition and some kind of reaching out to a community that was so traumatized, and that they hadn't done that. And then to add insult to injury, they didn't only not reach out with some form of compassion or commiseration to many of us, many people in our community who had lost loved ones, as Jews around the world had. But that not only did they not come out with any form of compassion or reached out in that way, but that they then doubled down on that by taking a side. And I think that's very relevant in the context of South Africa. And South Africa has always prided itself, and it's a position it's taken in every single other global conflict. It's always said their position is to be peacemakers, and to be a peacemaker, you speak to both sides. And that's the position that they took on the Russia-Ukraine war. It's the position they've taken on a number of African conflicts, and it's perhaps an understandable position, which has come out of our own experience of ending apartheid. You speak to your enemies. You find peace by speaking to your enemies, not by speaking to your friend. And that's something that actually we've always supported the government in doing. We really felt that it could play a real role in bringing about peace, in having the hostages released. They did, in fact, know both sides. And instead, against their own stated policy of speaking to both sides, being a peacemaker, they chose a side. They chose to take the only Jewish date, and I suppose that's where it comes to the 29th of December, which is a date as kind of branded in our minds in South Africa almost as the 7th of October, because we saw it as such a betrayal. It was the date that they chose to take the only Jewish date to the court that was designed to protect, that was designed after the Holocaust as a result of the genocide against Jews, to do that kind of inversion, to go against their own policy and principles and do that on the 29th of December. That was just the final betrayal for the Jewish community.
So, right. So South Africa on December 29 started a lawsuit in the International Court of Justice against Israel with the allegation of genocide. And
to the
from what I understand, not long before that, Hamas had visited the government and the the Minister of Foreign Affairs or International Relations had visited Iran. And there are, from what I hear from you, close relationships between the three of them. So is it Hamas, in fact, who influenced, or Iran who influenced this lawsuit the start of a lawsuit in the International Court of Justice through South Africa's government? Is that what happened, you think?
So it's hard to say exactly what, and I think the one thing that the one thing that we didn't mention, or perhaps was missed in our timeline, is that very soon after October the 7th, again, the same Minister of Foreign Affairs, Benaleli Pendle, had a phone call with Hamas. That would have been probably 10 days, maybe 2 weeks after the October the 7th, which again was something quite bizarre. The idea that a terrorist organization who has just committed those kind of atrocities has a cozy call with a minister of a democratic, not just a minister, but a senior minister of a democratic country. And again, the only way we found out about it was because, in fact, it was on the Hamas website, and someone picked it up on the Hamas website that this call had happened. So the government has denied it. They have said that this was not why they did it. But we can't ignore the fact that these events occurred in the context of a close relationship with Iran, a strengthening of the relationship between South Africa and Iran, and against a background where there clearly is a relationship between the government and Hamas, or at least there is certainly connection between the government and Hamas.
Wow. So that this is not only traumatic for the Jewish community in South Africa, it's also of worldwide significance to know these facts behind behind South Africa taking Israel to the International Court of Justice.
Was there an official response by the government to your letter for the Jewish community in the newspaper?
So a little while later, not immediately, and this is it's kind of part of the whole story. And I'm sorry, I think it was the 13th of December, but I stand corrected on. I could have got the date slightly wrong.
You're right.
Just before the third, so again, October the 7th happened. We probably sent the letter out around the 14th of October. We continued to put out statements through October. We heard very little in November, and then at very short notice, we were invited to a meeting by the president in his residence in Pretoria to come and meet with him to address the concerns that we had raised. And
wait, so when is this? So when is the meeting?
So this is early, the second week of December.
So we're talking 2 months later.
2 months later,
we had been
news of the RCJ case.
No one knew anything about the RCJ.
Nobody knew anything about the RCJ case. At that stage, we had approached it wasn't in response to the open letter, which was the only thing that we saw in response to the open letter was there was a definite a little bit of a pullback. In particular, for the first time, we started seeing them calling for the release of the hostages. Prior to that, there had been no call for release of hostages. And for the first time, we started seeing some condemnation, admittedly quite weak, but some condemnation of the Hamas attack. Whether or not that was due to the letter is anyone's guess.
I also wrote a letter. I did write a piece in Haaretz, which the president referred to. He writes every Monday, and I'm going to just interrupt and say that because today's letter that he wrote is significant as well. But every Monday he writes to his fellow South Africans. It's on the website, etc. It's communication with the people. And in one of those, I had written a very scathing and very aggressive piece in Haaretz about expressing our views. And he wrote in response how he was disappointed that somebody would write and call that we would suggest that the fact that the South African, because I suggested, are we to be expecting pogroms in South Africa if he doesn't acknowledge what happened in Israel? He didn't like that. So there was definitely an indication that he has and that the government have seen our correspondence. Hey, Karen?
No question, they've seen our correspondence, they made reference. So, I mean, in addition to the open letter, there were Mary's article in the Haaretz, various press statements that we'd put out in the interim. But we also, and we'd been writing to him on top of that, asking for a meeting, because we had seen a huge spike, not comparable perhaps to other countries, but we had seen a spike in anti-Semitism. We also had a real problem, and still do have a problem, with boycotts of Jewish businesses, which in a country which has massive unemployment rate, you would have thought a government would be concerned about, aside from its concern around the problematics of the Jewish community being targeted in that way, and some issues we were having around the closure of the consulate of the South African consulate in Tel Aviv. That was the agenda that we had stepping into the meeting. But we found, unfortunately, at the end of the meeting, the president expressed to us his view that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza when there was no opportunity for us to respond. And then we found ourselves cited in the court case papers. The South African court papers refer to the meeting that they had with the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, as if they had, and there's only one way to interpret it, it is as if we were representing Israel, which we certainly weren't. We were coming there to represent South African Jews and the concerns we had for South African Jews around the anti-Semitism and boycott of Jewish businesses that we'd been experiencing. And in those papers, they indicated that the South African government had informed and had raised a dispute at some level with Israel through the various interactions that they'd had with the embassy here and in a meeting that they'd had with the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. So I think for us, that was the kind of death knell for any kind of functional relationship going forward under those circumstances.
Yes.
Could we clarify something, because our audience is around the world? The South African Board of Deputies, just tell us exactly, is it overall the synagogues? Who does it encompass?
So it's really got the fundamental and primary aim, and its mandate is to protect the civil rights of South African Jews. That's its mandate. It's been going for 120 years. So it's really one of the first Jewish institutions, and South African Jewry have been in South Africa for hundreds of years. We're not a new community. So that's our core mandate, and as part of that core mandate, what we do is we fight anti-Semitism. We represent the Jewish community to the South African government, so it was directly our role that resulted in this meeting, and it is correct that we should be meeting with the government over issues of concern for the South African government, for the South African Jewry, apologies, and then also we build bridges of friendship across various communities in South Africa. As good South African citizens, we believe that is part of our core mandate as well.
So it must have been scary, I guess, to be held responsible as an official South African Jewish body, to be held responsible for Israel's policies, to have that generalization of the Jewish state to the representatives of the Jewish community. Is that correct?
So I'm going to pass on to Mary now, because I think she can talk best on this, because I'm going to move on to the next kind of stage, which is soon after the case was actually heard, because it connects to your question now. So absolutely, it really is, everything about that meeting in the end was disturbing in the way that a genuine meeting that was held with the government to express concerns of the Jewish community around anti-Semitism was used in this way. Obviously, it feels deeply like a deep betrayal. And then as time has gone on, and this idea, and I think it's really important, the Jewish community, and certainly the post-1994, which is the end of apartheid, was in 1994. So the post-apartheid Jewish community, we have felt such an important part of building up this country in a post-apartheid time. And we've really felt we take tremendous pride in our South African citizenship. And I think that, and I'm going to ask Mary I think she knows where I'm going with this anyway, to carry on about how subsequent to that, again, not on the ground, but what we're seeing at a ministerial level in terms of the rhetoric that has come out that has attempted to separate us to some extent as South Africans, as Zionists, has been hugely problematic. And I'm sure Mary knows what I'm referring to, so I'll let her take up the story.
Yeah, so I think, so you can imagine the difficulty. I'm sure you were also watching the court case and watching the South African government and wearing their, I mean, scarves that we would normally wear to a football match. And this was our government. And this is, I can't describe as a South African Jew, as a South African who was born here, who's felt so uplifted by the transition, the miraculous transition to our own democracy, and to have been a part of that, to feel that sense of betrayal. But it also was difficult for us as the leadership to hold our community in our hands and keep them buoyant in the face of it all. So what made it really difficult is post those two court appearances, the first one was always the group who went to the courts, which included the Minister of International Relations, as you so rightly say, Evelyn, and the Minister of Justice. And the Minister of Justice on the court steps at The Hague, they had press conferences afterwards, and that he was asked immediately post the presentation by South Africa on the first day, before Israel responded, you know, there is a suggestion, the press are asking him, there's a suggestion that in fact this motivation is partly anti-Semitic, that there's an issue, that the government have issues around Jews, and that's part of the motivation. And his answer went something like, oh, no, we don't have a problem with Jews. They live among us. That we have Jews in South Africa and they live among us. So I don't want to even go into all the other possibilities, but as an educator and as somebody who founded a Holocaust and Genocide Center 15 years ago, if you start to talk about they and us, and you start to separate who are the people, us and them, that is the beginning of the slippery slope,
Yes,
of hatred. And if we as a community, he referenced how, no, they do business in South Africa. So feeding every stereotype. They do business in South Africa and they live among us. So we are South Africans, but they live here. So
Very painful.
those are the incredibly hurtful statements. Never mind irresponsible. The deep hurt that comes from a Minister of Justice telling the world stage on the steps at The Hague, Jews do business in South Africa. We don't have anti-Semitism. There is no anti-Semitism. He then doubled down on that, despite the fact that the motivation for the meeting that Karen refers to on the 13th of December was to express our concerns for the South African citizens who were experiencing anti-Semitism and the spike and the real problem of boycotting, calls to boycott Jewish business. The Minister of Justice, basically said, there's no anti-Semitism. He doesn't know what you're talking about. So we always go back to the fact that we live in this country where we've lived an incredibly full, meaningful, rich Jewish life, but it's against this incredibly difficult backdrop. And so, Karen, I think your point is that, and that's what you were leading into, is that the irresponsible and deeply hurtful utterances of senior members of our government have created a real difficulty for the Jewish community, so much so that it's kind of hard to remind oneself that you're actually living a full Jewish life, and that we don't have issues with Purim parties, or we don't think twice about any of that. But it's about the government and these letters. So once again, and I'm going to sort of just finish this question with our president writes every Monday, and today on the 8th of April, he writes about having spent this weekend in Kigali. Yesterday, the 7th of April, is the anniversary of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994. It is Kwibuka, as it's known as Kwibuka in Rwanda, and this year was the 30th anniversary, a very significant anniversary to commemorate the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and many heads of state, President Herzog included, and our President Ramaphosa. And he writes in his letter to the South Africans today how he cannot stand idly by, and I'm quoting, as another genocide is carried out in the Gaza Strip. The president was addressing the nation through his weekly newsletter following his visit to Rwanda on the occasion of the commemoration of the genocide against the Tutsi. And I'll quote, "At the numerous Rwandan genocide 30th commemoration memorials, one finds the words never again. The phrase never again also appears on the memorials to the Nazi Holocaust and is evoked as a reminder to the world of the horrors perpetrated by humankind and of the collective responsibility we share to ensure that this dark history does not repeat itself. And so it's because of our stated commitment to never again allow atrocities of this kind that the world cannot stand idly by as another genocide is carried out, this time against the people of Palestine in the besieged Gaza Strip, etc., etc." So didn't stop on the 29th of December.
I want to ask a very mundane question. Do your synagogues have armed guards in front of them?
So they're not armed guards. We do have a community organization. We get no state support for it, just in case you thought we do. We get no funding for it at all. And that's been going for many, many years, long prior to the 7th of October. The community does have sort of from the community, people who stand guard outside our synagogues.
Are
They have for years.
They have for years. That's not new. For years. Largely, I think, mostly concerned about, terrorist attacks going back many, many years.
So it hasn't been increased since October 7th.
The security has been increased up and down, and that varies both in terms of the context of the country, but also more, we look globally there as well. So obviously, like every Jewish community, I think that the Jewish community is always vulnerable to terror attacks when something happens in the Middle East. So the security varies depending on our assessment also of the global threat
level,
which is around the world.
Well, I read an article about the ties between Hamas and the government of South Africa and Iran, and the allegation starting the lawsuit in the International Court of Justice, that this in fact should be seen as a war of propaganda, a war of information or propaganda against Israel, part of that, and not physically threatening Israel or the Jewish community. It's more about damaging the image of Israel, so that everybody in the world will turn against Israel. Do you agree with that, or is this, like Phyllis suggests, more a threat towards the Jewish community in South Africa?
I think, and Mary also knows a bit more about this than I do. I think it's quite hard I don't think that there's, and I'm not going to make any suggestion that there are any physical threats emanating from our government against the Jewish community in South Africa. There aren't. But I think at the same time, I think it would be naive not to recognize that the heightened rhetoric does create an environment where such things could happen. And I think that for us, that's the concern. And I spoke about the boycott of Jewish businesses, which is, it's happened before, but this is the first time it's really having an effect. And I think...
Who's calling for it? I wanted to ask you that question. Is it an official group? Who's saying boycott Jewish businesses?
So there are a number of pro-Palestinian lobby organizations in South Africa, and for the most part, it's coming from pro-Palestinian lobby organizations in South Africa. And then there is something called the Muslim Judicial Council, which it hasn't called, as far as I know, for boycotts against Jewish businesses, but it certainly has against Israeli products. But for the most part, the call for boycotts has come from pro-Palestinian lobby groups in South Africa. And I think that I don't think, and what I can say is that we certainly have the support, and it's important that we have the support of the security services, for example, in South Africa, who will, if needed and if called, and who we liaise with around any threats that we feel that we might be experiencing as a community. And we liaise with them a lot, and that's one of the reasons that we feel we can continue to live quite comfortably here. So there is, from that point of view, no, there's no direct
That's
physical...
state security. Sorry to interrupt.
That's state security. I'm not, we call them the security cluster in South Africa, but it's really about both anti-terrorism, it's internal security, it's police services, all of those groupings together. We do interact with, and we have faith that there's no intention to create, that I have no doubt, there's no intention to create a physical threat against Jews in South Africa. However, the kind of rhetoric that we see and that's coming out of, which goes way beyond any kind of reasoned or even unreasonable criticism of Israel, it really has gone way beyond that. There's a concern there that can switch quite quickly. And again, the reason we're not seeing that switch, and we aren't seeing it, is because we don't think that this is something that is finding fertile ground amongst ordinary South African citizens. But it doesn't mean that we're not alert to the dangers. And in fact, one of the major marches that took place early in October, which against the Israeli embassy, which included the ruling party, was part of that march. They were one of the organizers of the march. And one of our journalists, who's completely neutral, not a Jewish journalist, she called it a Jew baiting jamboree. That's what she called that march. And I mean, I think that is what you're seeing. We're not seeing that translating, and I don't want to give the impression that there's a direct physical threat on the community. But there certainly is a rhetoric that is concerning, and it is difficult as a community to sit here with a government that is so hostile. And that's the paradox that Mary and I keep talking about. We really, it's hard to get it across. I feel, and I'm trying not to sound contradictory. It's not contradictory, it's just paradoxical. We have a very hostile government, but in fact, continue living our lives in spite of, probably. But there's no physical threat projected against us, no.
As we come to the end of our time with you, would you each or either like to say something kind of an ending? Although, Karen, I think that you made a really important point that we should realize. So in many ways, it sounds like Jews are much less threatened on the ground in South Africa than here in the United States. And yet the government is much more hostile in South Africa than the United States. Although that changes daily. Okay, no political. And Mary, is there something you want to add to what Karen said, or either of you, before we end this really, really informative discussion?
Just to add that our community is incredibly resilient. And as we as a global world are yesterday commemorating 6 months since October 7th and, moving into Pesach, there's a real sense of being together and just mourning so much of what was, but also feeling that we as a community have got a lot to be grateful for. And we are certainly incredibly grateful for the support we've had from global Jewry and the reaching out that we've had, the support. We feel held, we feel valued by global Jewish communities across the globe. The support we've received has been extraordinary, and people understand the pain that we feel as a community to be South African at this time that is so painful for Israel. So as a community, I just want to reassure you that we are resilient, but we are also incredibly grateful for so much.
And I just want to say, I'm very impressed that you have the courage to stand up, to speak up, which is what we encourage on our program all the time, and which didn't happen, unfortunately, in the German Jews early on in the 30s. So we have to really take our hats off to what you and the South African Jewish community and the South African Jewish Board of Deputies is doing. We thank you so much for being on the show. We thank our listeners. For those of you who would like to know more about Evelyn and myself, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And as I just said, as we always end and encourage people to speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.